Edward Blake, a stoic 71-year-old Marine veteran, faces cruel mockery at Bayview Beans Cafe for his wheelchair and veteran status. Unfazed, he guards a wooden box of memories from fallen comrades, enduring taunts with quiet dignity. As the hecklers escalate, filming their expose, an older woman and a man named Dawson recognize Edward's heroic past. Suddenly, 4 military SUVs arrive, and 6 Marines enter, saluting Edward. Their leader reveals his legendary Fallujah rescue, sparking awe and shame in the cafe. What secrets lie in Edward's box? And why does he keep his weekly vigil? Support Q Incredible Stories. Subscribe to honor unsung heroes like Edward Blake. Share their tales of sacrifice and dignity to inspire respect. Join our community to keep these powerful stories alive. Hit subscribe, leave a comment, and help us celebrate the quiet heroes among us. Thank you. Every Friday at precisely 2 p.m. Edward Ed Blake, a 71-year-old Marine Corps veteran, wheeled himself into Bayview Beans Cafe in Pensacola, Florida. The ritual was as unchanging as the tides in the harbor he loved to watch. Table 6, tucked against the window with a clear view of the docks where Navy ships occasionally loomed, was his sanctuary. He'd order a black coffee, strong and unadorned, paired with a slice of apple pie, its flaky crust and tart filling a quiet nod to simpler times. For 90 minutes he'd sit, his gaze fixed on the water, lost in memories that weighed heavier than the wheelchair that carried him. This Friday marked 5 years of these weekly pilgrimages, a milestone unnoticed by the bustling cafe staff, who knew him only as the quiet, dignified regular with a weathered face and steady hands that sometimes trembled. In his lap, cradled with the care of a father holding a newborn, rested a small wooden box, its surface worn smooth by years of touch. Inside, it held fragments of a life most could scarcely imagine. Marine Corps medals, their once bright shine dulled by time, faded photographs of young men in desert camouflage, their smiles frozen in moments before the world shattered, and letters, creased and yellowed, that Edward had written but never sent to the families of those who didn't come home. Each item was a tether to a past he both cherished and mourned, a past that had cost him both legs in a single searing moment outside Kandahar, Afghanistan. An improvised explosive device had not only ended his 30-year military career, but had stolen 2 of his Marines, men he had sworn to bring home. The physical pain lingered, a constant companion in his bones, but it was the emotional wounds, etched deep in the lines of his sun-scorched face and the distant, watchful calm of his hazel eyes, that told the truer story. Edward had made peace with his losses, or so he told himself, but the weight of those young men's faces never lifted. This Friday, Bayview Beans hummed with an unusual energy. A group of college students, fresh from the exhilaration of finals week, filled the air with laughter and the clatter of mugs, their voices a stark contrast to the cafe's usual afternoon hush. Edward navigated the crowded space with the precision of a man who'd learned to adapt, his wheelchair gliding smoothly between tables. Patrons, caught up in their own worlds, shifted chairs or stepped aside with absent-minded courtesy, and Edward offered a polite nod each time, a silent thank you born of habit. At table 6, he set down a small laminated card that read, "Veteran, please serve gently." It wasn't a plea for pity, but a practical request, a quiet acknowledgement of hands that sometimes shook, and a startled reflex honed by years of ducking mortar fire. The card was his shield, a way to navigate a world that didn't always understand the scars beneath his calm exterior. Megan, a new waitress in her early 20s, approached with a nervous smile, her ponytail bobbing as she balanced a coffee pot and a plate of pie. "Good afternoon, sir." "The usual?" Her voice was bright but tentative, as if she sensed the gravity that clung to Edward like a shadow. He nodded, his voice a gravelly whisper, shaped by years of barking orders over the roar of helicopter blades. "Thank you, young lady." The words were soft but carried the weight of sincerity. As Megan poured his coffee, Edward arranged his wooden box with meticulous care, aligning it perfectly parallel to the table's edge, a ritual that grounded him in the present while he drifted into the past. At a nearby table, 3 men in their 30s, dressed in sharp business casual attire, pressed shirts, polished shoes, and the easy confidence of corporate life, Watch the exchange. One leaned toward another, whispering something that sparked a low chuckle. Edward noticed but chose to ignore it, his focus returning to the harbor outside, where the water shimmered under the Florida sun. But the men's voices grew louder, their words slicing through the cafe's chatter. "Look at this," one said, his tone carrying just enough to reach Edward's ears. "Special service for the supposed hero. What kind of veteran uses a wheelchair as a prop for attention?" The words hung in the air, sharp and deliberate, like a blade testing its edge. Megan froze, her coffee pot hovering mid-pour, her eyes flicking between Edward and the men. Her cheeks flushed with a mix of embarrassment and indignation, but she didn't know how to respond. Edward, unfazed, met her gaze with a calm that seemed almost otherworldly. "It's all right," he said softly, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. "Please continue." But the leader of the group, emboldened by Edward's lack of reaction, pressed further. "What kind of veteran begs for special treatment with a little card?" he said, his voice rising to ensure every patron heard. "My grandfather was in Vietnam, and he never asked for handouts. Never needed a sob story to get a cup of coffee." The cafe fell into an uneasy quiet, the students' laughter fading as heads turned. Eyes darted between the hecklers and Edward, who sat motionless, his hands resting protectively on his wooden box. The weight of the moment pressed down on the room, but no one stepped in. The air felt thick with unspoken tension, the kind that makes bystanders shift uncomfortably in their seats. Edward's face remained impassive, but his eyes, those eyes that had seen too much, flickered with something unspoken. Not anger, not shame, but a quiet resolve, a strength forged in places these men could never comprehend. He sipped his coffee, the steam curling around his weathered face, and turned his gaze back to the harbor, as if the men's words were no more than a passing breeze. The leader, a tall man with an expensive watch that gleamed under the cafe's lights, wasn't satisfied. Edward's silence seemed to fuel his irritation, as if he'd expected a confrontation, a chance to prove his point. "Bet he's not even a real veteran," he said, loud enough for the entire cafe to hear. "Probably just some guy playing the part for sympathy. But look at him, sitting there with his little box like it's a trophy case." His friends laughed, a sharp, mocking sound that cut through the room. One pulled out a smartphone, aiming it at Edward with a smirk. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, his voice dripping with sarcasm, "meet the hero of Bayview Beans." Megan, her hands trembling now, approached Edward again, her voice barely above a whisper. "Sir, would you like me to ask them to stop? Or I can call the manager." Her eyes were wide with worry, her inexperience clear in the way she clutched the coffee pot like a lifeline. Edward looked up, his weathered face softening into a gentle smile that seemed to carry the wisdom of decades. "No need, miss," he said, his voice low but firm. There was a time when words like those would have cut deep. That time's long gone. He returned to his coffee, his hand still resting on the wooden box, as if shielding its contents from the cruelty of the moment. Inside, though, Edward felt the familiar ache, not of anger but of memory. The men's words didn't wound him. They couldn't. He'd faced worse than their petty taunts, explosions that shook the earth, screams that haunted his dreams, and the unbearable silence of a battlefield after the fight. But their ignorance stung, a reminder of how easily the sacrifices of his Marines, his brothers, could be dismissed. He thought of the photographs in his box, of the young men who'd trusted him, who'd laughed and fought and died under his command. He thought of the letters he'd written, each one an attempt to make sense of loss, each one left unsent because no words could ever be enough. As the men continued their mockery, their voices growing bolder with each unanswered jab, Edward remained a still point in the storm. He'd learned long ago that reacting to every slight was a battle not worth fighting. His strength lay not in confrontation, but in endurance, in carrying the weight of his past with quiet dignity. The cafe's other patrons watched, some with pity, some with discomfort, but none with the courage to intervene. The air grew heavier, the men's laughter a grating counterpoint to the soft clink of Edward's coffee cup against its saucer. Outside, the harbor gleamed, a Navy ship just visible on the horizon. Edward's eyes lingered there, his thoughts drifting to the men he'd lost, the promises he'd kept, and the ones he'd failed. The wooden box sat under his hand, a silent testament to a life of service, of pain, and of resilience. He didn't need to prove anything to these men. He'd already fought his wars. The sharp, mocking voice of the ringleader cut through the hum of the cafe like a blade. "Well, look at this, boys. We've got ourselves a real American hero," he sneered, his words dripping with derision. "So heroic, he needs a fancy little car just to get his coffee." His two companions erupted into laughter, their guffaws echoing off the walls of Babu Beans, a small, cozy spot where the scent of roasted coffee mingled with the faint sweetness of pastries. The trio's cruel amusement drew uneasy glances from other patrons, who shifted in their seats, their discomfort palpable. Some frowned, their eyes flickering with disapproval, but none dared to intervene, their courage limited to silent judgment. Edward Blake sat at his usual corner table, his wheelchair positioned carefully to avoid blocking the narrow aisle. His weathered hands, marked by age and the lingering effects of nerve damage from years of military service, reached for his fork. The simple act was a struggle. His fingers trembled, betraying the toll of his past. The fork slipped from his grasp, clattering onto the tiled floor with a sharp, metallic ring. The sound seemed to amplify the tension in the room. "Stand up and get it yourself," one of the men shouted, his voice thick with mockery. Another round of laughter followed, harsh and unrelenting, as if Edward's struggle was their personal entertainment. Edward's sharp, clear eyes scanned the scene with the same tactical precision that had once guided him through war zones. The fork lay just beyond his reach, a small but insurmountable obstacle in the cramped cafe. Retrieving it would mean maneuvering his wheelchair through the tight space, potentially bumping into tables and disturbing other customers. His mind, still sharp despite the years, weighed the options with the calm deliberation of a man who had once navigated minefields. He began to reposition his chair, each movement deliberate, his face a mask of quiet determination. Inside, though, a flicker of frustration stirred. Not at the men, but at the limitations of his body, a body that had once carried him through chaos with unyielding strength. Megan, the young waitress with kind eyes and a quick step, hurried over, her face flushed with a mix of concern and embarrassment for Edward. "Please, sir, let me get that for you," she said softly, bending to retrieve the fork. Edward paused, looking up at her. His gaze was steady, unguarded, and carried a weight that seemed to silence the room for a moment. "It's all right," he said, his voice low but firm, devoid of self-pity or anger. "I'm used to it." Those simple words, spoken with quiet resolve, seemed to ripple through the Rani, momentarily stifling the heckler's enthusiasm. The ringleader's smirk faltered as if Edward's unshakable dignity had pierced the bubble of their cruelty. In that brief, heavy silence, the air felt charged with something unspoken, a recognition of the man Edward was, even if the trio refused to see it. In the corner, an older woman sat alone, her coffee untouched as she observed the scene. Her eyes, sharp despite her age, lingered on Edward, taking in the details of his weathered jacket. Then she saw it, a small bronze pin on his lapel, a subtle emblem that most would overlook. To her, it was unmistakable, the mark of a specialized Marine unit, long since decommissioned, known only to those who understood its history. Her breath caught, and her eyes widened slightly in recognition. Without a word, she slipped outside, her phone already in hand, her fingers trembling not from age but from the urgency of what she had just witnessed. The moment of quiet passed, and the three men, perhaps unnerved by the shift in the room's atmosphere, doubled down on their cruelty. The leader pulled out his phone, his fingers flying across the screen as he posted a video of Edward's struggle, captioning it with a vicious jab. "Coffee shop warrior, cheap drama." Within minutes, his phone buzzed with notifications as the post gained traction online. "Look at that," he crowed, his voice loud enough to carry across the cafe. "We're going viral, boys. People love seeing these fake heroes get exposed." His companions grinned, feeding off the attention, their laughter a sharp contrast to the growing unease among the other patrons. Edward, seemingly unmoved, continued eating his apple pie, each bite measured and deliberate. To the casual observer, he might have appeared oblivious to the mockery, his face a mask of calm resignation. but those who looked closer would notice the subtle signs of his awareness. The slight tightening of his jaw, the way his hands methodically repositioned the small wooden box on the table in front of him. That box, worn but meticulously cared for, held more than just trinkets. It was a repository of memories, of promises kept, of lives lost. Edward's heart, though steady, carried the weight of those memories, and each taunt from the men was a reminder of the world's indifference to the sacrifices he and others had made. At the counter, a middle-aged man in plain, nondescript clothing watched the scene unfold with keen interest. His posture was casual, but his eyes were sharp, missing nothing. When Edward opened his wooden box to check his watch, revealing a glint of military medals tucked inside, the man's eyebrows lifted ever so slightly. He paid his bill quietly, slipped outside, and pressed his phone to his ear. "Captain, it's Dawson," he said in a low voice. "You're not going to believe who I just saw at Babu Beans." "Yes, sir." "Edward Blake." "The Edward Blake from Fallujah." "No, sir, I'm certain. He's still got that wooden box. They're disrespecting him, sir." "Yes, sir, I'll wait here." His voice carried a quiet urgency, a mix of disbelief and respect for the man he had just recognized. Inside, the situation grew uglier. One of the men, emboldened by the attention their video was getting, wadded up a napkin and tossed it toward Edward's table. It landed perfectly in his open wooden box, a small but deliberate act of disrespect. Inside the box, now partially visible, lay a weathered envelope, its corner revealing a handwritten line, "If I never make it back, Ed is the man to trust." Edward's hand moved for this surprising speed, closing the box with a soft but firm snap. His knuckles whitened as he gripped the wooden edges, and for a fleeting moment, his expression darkened, a glimpse of the pain and anger he kept tightly controlled. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, the shadow passed, and his face returned to his practiced neutrality. "Ooh, did we touch a nerve?" the leader taunted, leaning forward with a mocking grin. "What's in the box, old man? Participation trophies?" His companions snickered, but the atmosphere in the cafe was shifting. A few customers gathered their belongings, their discomfort now outweighing their desire to stay. The young cafe manager, barely out of college, hovered near the counter, his face a mask of indecision. He wanted to step in, to protect Edward, but the thought of confronting paying customers, loud, aggressive ones at that, kept him frozen. His hands fidgeted with a rag, his eyes darting between Edward and the trio. Edward glanced at his watch again, a military-issue timepiece with a scratched face that had seen more combat than most soldiers. It was 3:15 p.m., and 15 minutes remained in his weekly ritual. Despite the hostility surrounding him, he showed no intention of leaving early. His presence was a quiet act of defiance, a refusal to let their cruelty dictate his actions. When Megan returned with a coffee refill, her hands trembling slightly under the weight of the trio's scrutiny, Edward spoke softly to her. "I come here every Friday at this time because I made a promise," he said, his voice steady but heavy with meaning. "A promise to who?" Megan asked, her eyes flicking nervously toward the three men who were now scrolling through their phones, reveling in their growing social media clout. "To the men who couldn't come home," Edward replied simply. "We agreed that whoever survived would remember the others. This was the last American cafe several of them visited before deployment." His words hung in the air, a quiet testament to a bond forged in the crucible of war. For a moment, Megan's eyes softened, and she saw not just an old man in a wheelchair, but a keeper of memories, a guardian of promises. The weight of his words seemed to anchor the room, even as the trio's laughter threatened to shatter the fragile moment of understanding. The harbor glimmered under the morning sun, its waves whispering tales of journeys long past the docks where ships once sailed. Edward Blake's eyes, etched with the wear of countless vigils, drifted toward that distant point, a quiet nod to a memory he carried like a sacred burden. The gesture was faint, but Megan, the server with a heart, caught its meaning. She nodded back, her chest tightening as the ritual's weight settled over her. This wasn't just a man sipping coffee by a window. It was a pilgrimage to a past that clung to him, unyielding. Her phone buzzed faintly, and she glanced at it, her breath catching. A video of Edward, filmed in secret, was spreading like wildfire online, its view count climbing into the hundreds. It's everywhere, she murmured, her voice thick with dread. The idea of strangers picking apart this quiet man for their entertainment twisted her insides. Edward's face didn't shift, his gaze still locked on the horizon. "Young lady," he said, his tone calm as a still lake, "when you've dodged real bullets, a phone camera doesn't scare you much." His words weren't loud, but they carried the weight of a man who'd stared down death and walked away. Megan bit her lip, grappling with the chasm between his world and the cafe's chatter. Outside, the parking lot hummed with new arrivals. Cars and trucks pulled in, their engines growling softly as their drivers stayed put, watching. A man named Dawson stood by the door, his stance sharp, his eyes darting to his watch like a soldier awaiting orders. Whatever was coming, it was timed to the second. Inside, Edward seemed untouched by the brewing storm. His hands, rough as old leather, cradled a wooden box on the table. It was unassuming, but to him, it was a vault of memories no online taunt could tarnish. The cafe's whispers and sidelong glances bounced off him, insignificant against the battles he'd survived. The cruelty peaked when a tall man, puffed up by the validation of his phone's notifications, sauntered over to Edward's table. His smirk was a weapon honed to humiliate. "You know what I think?" he said, his voice cutting through the cafe's hum, loud enough for all to hear. "That veteran gear you've got on looks like it came from a Halloween aisle." The words landed like a blow, and the room seemed to pause, patrons holding their breath. Edward didn't blink. His eyes, which had once traced enemy movements through smoke and shadow, met the man's with a steady calm. He stayed silent, his quiet strength a barrier the heckler couldn't expect. Unfazed, the man leaned closer, relishing his audience. "Real soldiers have fire, discipline. They don't mope around with sad little cards fishing for handouts." A few customers averted their eyes, their faces burning with discomfort. Megan stood nearby, her coffee pot gripped like a lifeline, her heart pounding. She wanted to step in, to stop this cruelty, but her legs felt like they'd turned to stone. A friend of the heckler joined in, pointing his phone at Edward. "Come on, hero," he jeered. "Say something for the fans. They're loving this fake soldier takedown." Edward's silence seemed to enrage them further. The tall man's eyes glinted as he reached for the wooden box. "What's so important in here, huh? Let's see those dollar store medals." His hand was inches from the lid when Edward moved. Quick as a flash, his hand closed around the man's wrist. He didn't twist or yank, he just held it, his grip steady as a man who'd once wrestled enemies to the ground. "Not this," Edward said, his voice like quiet thunder. "Not ever this." The cafe seemed to a hush. The heckler pulled back, his confidence shaken as if he'd touched something untouchable. "You see that?" he blustered, looking for allies. "He grabbed me! This guy's dangerous! I'm getting the manager!" But the crowd's eyes were uneasy, their support thin. A deep rumble of engines outside broke the moment. Through the cafe's wide windows, everyone watched as 4 black SUVs glided into the lot. Their formation tight as a military parade. A command jeep followed, its Marine Corps emblem snapping in the wind. The cafe fell silent, breaths held. 6 Marines in pristine uniforms stepped inside, their presence filling the room. Their medals gleamed, each one a silent story of sacrifice. The silver-haired officer, his authority as natural as breathing, scanned the space before locking eyes with Edward. The hecklers slunk back to their table, their bravado gone. One scrambled to erase his video as the Marines approached. The officer stepped forward, saluting with precision. "Sergeant Major Blake, Alpha Company, 3rd Battalion," he said, his voice warm with respect. "Sir, we're sorry for being late." The other Marines formed a semicircle, each offering a salute. The cafe was still, every patron riveted. The officer turned slightly, his voice addressing for all to hear. "Sergeant Major Blake led one of the most daring rescues in Marine Corps history. Fallujah 2004. 12 of us, cut off, surrounded, our ammo running dry. Against orders, Blake went back in. I was one of those 12. His voice caught, memories flooding back. 3 days, pinned down, thinking it was over. Blake didn't just find us. He cleared a path, alone, building by building. He took 2 bullets but wouldn't stop until every Marine was safe. The officer's eyes shone with restrained emotion as he continued. When the chopper came, Insurgents fired RPGs. Blake shielded 2 wounded Marines with his body. Those wounds cost him both legs, but he saved us all. He opened a polished wooden case, revealing a medal that gleamed with a blue ribbon. This is the Navy Cross, delayed too long. Paperwork and Blake's own refusal to seek praise kept this from him. Today we make it right. The moment the medal was placed in Edward's weathered hands, the young Marine who presented it stepped forward, his voice catching in his throat, trembling with a mixture of gratitude and awe. "Sergeant Major Blake," he began, his eyes glistening, "you pulled me from the wreckage of our vehicle after an IED tore through it. I was trapped, bleeding, sure I wouldn't make it. You risked everything to save me. For 15 years I've carried the weight of that day, waiting for this moment to thank you, sir." His words hung in the air, heavy with the raw memory of survival and sacrifice. The cafe, moments ago buzzing with the hum of casual conversation, fell into a stunned, reverent silence. One by one, the other Marines stepped forward, each sharing a story of Edward's courage, each testimony a window into the lives he had touched. Some spoke of moments under fire, where Edward's steady leadership had guided them to safety. Others recounted quieter acts, his refusal to leave a wounded comrade behind, his calm resolve in the face of chaos. Each story deepened the stillness in the room as patrons, their coffee cups forgotten, listened with growing humility. Several wiped tears from their cheeks, moved by the weight of what they were witnessing. The 3 young men who had earlier mocked Edward, their laughter loud and careless as they recorded him for a cruel social media post, now sat slumped in their booth. Their bravado had evaporated, replaced by a crushing shame that pinned their gazes to the floor. They had mocked a man whose story they couldn't begin to comprehend, and the truth of their misjudgment burned in their chests. The cafe felt smaller now, the air thick with the unspoken realization that they had crossed a line they could never uncross. When the final Marine finished speaking, Edward, who had sat silently through the tributes, his face a mask of stoic composure, finally spoke. His voice was steady, low, but carried the weight of a lifetime of service. "These honors," he said, holding the medal gently as if it were fragile, "they don't belong to me. They belong to the men who didn't come home. I accept them only as their representative, to carry their memory forward." His words were simple, but they struck the room like a quiet thunder, a reminder of the cost of freedom, paid by those who would never return to claim their share of it. Behind the counter, Megan, the young waitress who had served Edward every Friday for 5 years, stood frozen, her hands trembling as she clutched a dish towel. Tears streamed down her face, her heart twisting with regret. She had seen the hecklers taunting Edward, had heard their jeers, but had stayed silent, unsure of how to intervene. Now, the weight of her inaction pressed against her chest. When Edward's eyes met hers, kind and understanding despite the pain he must have felt, she whispered, her voice breaking, "I'm so sorry, sir. I should have said something. I should have stopped them." Edward shook his head gently, his expression softening. "Megan," he said, his voice warm, "you've done more than you know. For 5 years, you've given me a place to sit, to remember, to keep my promise. This cafe, your kindness, it's a sanctuary. That matters more than any words you could have said." His words lifted a small part of her guilt, but the ache of wishing she had done more lingered. One of the hecklers, a young man with a flushed butt and eyes brimming with remorse, found the courage to stand. He approached Edward hesitantly, his hands fidgeting as he struggled to find words. "Sir," he stammered, I had no idea. The video we posted, I'll take it down right now." Edward regarded him for a long moment, his gaze steady but not unkind. "No," he said finally. "Leave it up. Let it stay as a lesson. Let people see what happens when we judge a man without knowing his story. Maybe it'll make someone think twice before they do the same." The young man nodded, his throat tight with gratitude for Edward's grace, and returned to his seat, vowing silently to carry the weight of his mistake forward. The cafe manager, who had watched the scene unfold from the sidelines, finally stepped forward, his voice unsteady but resolute. "Sergeant Major," he said, "your money's no good here anymore. Not today, not ever again. It's the least we can do." Edward shook his head, his expression firm. "I'll pay my bill, same as anyone else," he said. "I didn't fight for special treatment. I fought for fairness, for a world where a man can sit at a table and be left in peace. The manager nodded, respecting Edward's conviction, and stepped back, his admiration for the man growing deeper. As the Marines prepared to leave, their mission complete, the silver-haired officer who had led the ceremony leaned close to Edward. "We'll be back next Friday if that's all right with you," he said quietly. "Some debts can never be repaid, but we'd like to try." For the first time that day, a faint smile broke through Edward's stoic demeanor, a flicker of warmth in his eyes. "Table 6, 0600 hours," he said softly. "Bring stories of the others." The officer nodded, a silent promise made, and the Marines departed, leaving the cafe quieter than it had ever been. Edward remained at his table, as he always did, completing his ritual of 90 minutes. The wooden box, his constant companion, sat beside him, its presence a quiet testament to the promises he kept. The three hecklers slipped out of the cafe, their heads bowed, their social media accounts now flooded with comments from locals who had learned the truth about Edward. The video they had posted, meant to mock, had instead become a beacon, spreading his story across the community and beyond. Before Edward left, Megan approached him one final time, her curiosity overcoming her hesitation. "Sir," she said softly, "can I ask, what's in the box, the one you guard so carefully?" Edward paused, his fingers resting on the worn wood. After a moment, he opened it, revealing its contents. Inside were several medals, their surfaces gleaming faintly, but they were not alone. Nestled among them were small, personal items, a scuffed baseball, a chipped poker chip, a scratched Zippo lighter, a folded sonogram image, yellowed with age. Megan's breath caught it as Edward spoke, his voice quiet but steady. "These belonged to men who asked me to remember them," he said. "Things they carried for luck, for love, for hope. I promised to protect them, to carry them until we meet again." Megan nodded, her eyes shining with understanding. "That's why you come here," she said. "Every Friday, same table, same time, to keep that promise." Edward closed the box gently, his movements deliberate. "Because somewhere they're watching, Thermo," he said, making sure I don't forget. As Edward wheeled himself toward the exit, the patrons stood one by one, a silent gesture of respect. It was a belated acknowledgement of the quiet hero who had sat among them for years, unrecognized but unwavering. The weight of their silence was not shame now, but gratitude, a recognition of the man who carried the memories of the fallen with every breath. In the weeks that followed, Bayview Beans transformed in ways no one could have foreseen. Table 6, Edward's regular spot, now bore a small bronze plaque, reserving it for those who had served. When Edward wasn't there for his Friday vigil, the table was open only to veterans, a quiet tribute to their shared sacrifice. A framed photograph of Edward receiving his Navy Cross hung on the wall nearby, its caption simple but profound. "Not all heroes wear their medals." The Marines, true to their word, returned the following Friday. 6 of them, spanning generations of service, joined Edward at a larger table pushed next to his usual spot. Their conversation was hushed, laced with the unique camaraderie of those who had faced death together and lived to honor those who hadn't. Laughter occasionally broke through, a reminder that joy could coexist with memory. This became a new tradition. Every Friday at 2:00 p.m., Edward would arrive, taking his place at table 6. By 2:15, Marines in civilian clothes, their military bearing unmistakable, would join him. Some weeks there were 3, others a dozen. The oldest, a Vietnam veteran with stories of jungles and muddy rivers, sat beside the youngest, a recent returnee from Syria, their experiences different, but their purpose the same. Edward welcomed them all, a guardian of the flame they shared. The wooden box remained at his side, its contents growing as each Marine brought new stories, new memories to be preserved. Together they kept the promise Edward had made, not just to the men whose relics he carried, but to each other, to never let the sacrifices of the fallen fade into silence. Every Friday at precisely 2 p.m., Edward Blake, a man etched with the quiet weight of time, stepped into Bayou Beans and settled at table 6. His ritual was as unchanging as the tides. A cup of black coffee, a slice of apple pie, and 90 minutes of silent remembrance. But to Edward, this was no mere routine. It was a sacred vow, a tether to memories he guarded with a ferocity that no one in the bustling cafe could have guessed. Each week he carried a small wooden box, its surface worn smooth by years of reverent handling, containing fragments of a past too precious to let fade. A unit coin, glinting faintly with the pride of shared battles. A handwritten note, its ink blurred by time but heavy with unspoken promises. A photograph, creased and faded, capturing faces that lived now only in Edward's heart. These were the relics of his service, entrusted to him by those who knew he would protect them with his life. To Edward, the box was a sanctuary, a vessel for the souls of comrades who never made it home. His weathered hands, steady despite their tremble, cradled it with a tenderness that belied the strength within, a strength forged in the crucible of war, tempered by loss and sustained by loyalty. The patrons of Bayou Beans, caught in their own hurried lives, barely noticed the old man at first. To them, he was just a fixture, a solitary figure hunched over his coffee, lost in thoughts they couldn't fathom. But for Edward, each sip was a communion, each bite a meditation on the men who'd stood beside him in places the world had long forgotten. His heart ached with the weight of their absence, but it also swelled with the honor of keeping their memory alive. He didn't need anyone to understand. The act itself was enough. Yet there was a quiet sorrow in his solitude, a flicker of longing for someone to see beyond the stooped shoulders and lined face, to glimpse the fortress of resilience he'd become. Megan, a young waitress with a quick smile and a heart that noticed more than most, saw something different in Edward. She'd been working the Friday afternoon shift when three men, loud and careless, shattered the cafe's hum with their mockery. They'd zeroed in on Edward, their words sharp and cruel, slicing at his quiet dignity. They laughed at his worn jacket, his deliberate movements, the box he guarded like a treasure. To them, he was just an old man, irrelevant and invisible. Megan's stomach twisted as she watched, her hands tightening around the coffee pot. She wanted to intervene, to shield him, but Edward's calm silence held her back. His eyes, steady and unyielding, met the taunts with a serenity that seemed to draw from a well of strength she couldn't comprehend. It wasn't defeat she saw in him, it was something far greater, a refusal to let their words diminish the promises he carried. When the men posted their mockery online thinking they'd won, Edward only suggested they leave the video up. Megan didn't understand why, but she felt a spark of awe at his composure, a sense that he was fighting a battle they couldn't see. That video, meant to humiliate, became something else entirely. It spread like wildfire, shared by military family support groups and sensitivity training programs, amassing millions of views. Each click was a lesson, a window into the cost of judging too quickly. For Edward, the attention changed nothing. Fame was a fleeting noise, irrelevant to the rhythm of his Fridays. But for Megan, it was a revelation. She'd seen Edward's humiliation, yes, but also his vindication. Not through anger, but through a quiet power that made the entire cafe take notice. Her heart swelled with a mix of admiration and resolve. She requested a permanent Friday shift, determined to be there to bear witness to Edward's ritual. Under her initiative, Bayou Beans launched a suspended coffee program, a small but meaningful gesture where patrons could prepay for veterans' orders. Soon the wall near the register bloomed with post-it notes, each one a testament to gratitude. Coffee for the next veteran, with thanks. A meal for someone who served in memory of my grandfather. Megan read each note with a lump in her throat, feeling the cafe transform into a space of quiet honor. She thought of Edward every time she pinned a new note to the wall, wondering what stories he carried that no one knew. The three men who'd mocked Edward never returned. Their absence was a relief, but Megan couldn't shake the memory of their cruelty. She wondered if they'd watched their own video, if they'd felt even a flicker of shame as it became a tool for education rather than ridicule. She hoped so, but her focus was on Edward now, on the man who'd turned their malice into a moment of collective awakening. On her personal social media, Megan poured out her thoughts, her words raw and heartfelt. I saw justice unfold, not with shouting or fists, but with a silence so profound it made a room full of strangers stand in respect. Edward didn't need to speak to be heard. His presence was enough. Her post rippled outward, touching hearts far beyond her small circle. each like and share a nod to the power of quiet dignity. Among the regulars was an elderly woman named Clara, who'd been there that fateful day. She'd watched, her hands trembling around her teacup as the men's words cut through the air. She'd always seen Edward as a lonely figure, a man lost in his own world. But that day, something shifted. She saw the weight he carried, the strength in his stillness. Later, she told a local newspaper, her voice thick with emotion, "I used to think he was just an old man sitting alone. Now I know he was a fortress, guarding something sacred we never bothered to see." Clara's words lingered in the air, a quiet rebuke to those who'd overlooked Edward, including herself. She began to sit closer to table 6 on Fridays, not to intrude, but to feel the echo of his resolve. It was her way of paying respect, of acknowledging a man she'd misjudged for too long. 6 months later, Edward did something no one expected. A local school group, working on a history project, asked to interview him. For decades, he'd kept his service locked away, the pain of those memories too raw to share. But something in the children's earnest faces softened his resolve. He sat with them, his voice steady but soft, and spoke not of battlefield heroics, but of the quieter truths. Loyalty to those who fought beside him, the sacrifices that lingered like shadows, the weight of remembering those left behind. A 10-year-old boy, eyes wide with curiosity, asked why Edward hadn't fought back against the men who mocked him. Edward's answer was simple, but it landed like a stone in still water. "When you've held dying friends in your arms, cruel words don't hurt the same. I've been wounded by experts." The room fell silent, the children absorbing the depth of his words. Another child, a girl with a notebook clutched to her chest, asked what he wanted people to remember about veterans like him. Edward paused, his eyes tracing the grain of the wooden box before him. "We're still keeping promises," he said, "made long ago on battlefields most have forgotten." His words were a quiet plea, not for pity, but for recognition of the silent burdens so many carried. Edward's story, the story of Sergeant Major Edward Blake, is a reminder that heroism doesn't always shout. It doesn't demand applause or beg for validation. Often it sits quietly at a cafe table, sipping black coffee, honoring promises the world never knew were made. What struck Megan most wasn't the moment when a group of Marines arrived to honor Edward, though that scene, crisp uniforms, salutes sharp with respect, brought tears to her eyes. No, it was Edward's unwavering commitment, week after week, regardless of how others saw him. He didn't come to Bayou Beans for recognition. He came for the men whose names were etched in his heart, for the promises he'd made to never let them fade. In a world that thrives on noise and instant outrage, Edward's quiet dignity was a rebellion, a testament to a strength that didn't need a spotlight to shine. Megan thought often about that wooden box, about the stories it held. She wondered about the men behind the coin, the note, the photograph. She imagined Edward in his youth, strong and unbowed, making promises in the chaos of war. She saw him now, older but no less resolute, carrying those promises like a sacred charge. It made her think of others like him, people who moved through the world with invisible burdens, their sacrifices unseen but no less real. How many Edwards were out there, she wondered, sitting in quiet corners, guarding memories the world had forgotten. The thought humbled her, made her want to look closer, to listen harder. Clara, too, carried Edward's story with her. She began writing letters to her grandchildren, telling them about the man at table 6, urging them to look beyond appearances. "The quietest person in the room," she wrote, "might be the one who's given the most." Her words were a promise of her own, a vow to keep Edward's lesson alive. For the school children who had heard his story, Edward became more than a history project. He was a living bridge to a past they had only read about, a reminder that history wasn't just dates and battles, it was people, promises, and the courage to keep going. Edward's ritual at Bayou Beans continued, unchanged by the attention. Every Friday he arrived at 2 p.m., ordered his coffee and pie, and sat for 90 minutes. But he was no longer alone. Sometimes a veteran would join him, their shared silence a language of its own. Sometimes a stranger would leave a post-it note, a small offering of gratitude. Megan watched it all, her heart full. She thought of the box, of the stories it held, and of the man who'd made himself its keeper. Edward Blake didn't need the world to see him. His worth was forged in moments of sacrifice most would never understand. But for those who did see, Megan, Clara, the children, the patrons who left notes, his quiet presence was a lesson in what it means to truly honor the past. In a world that often forgets, Edward's story reminds us to look closer, to listen, to remember that the greatest heroes might be the ones sitting quietly among us, keeping promises we'll never fully know.